Ralph going to Johnny Sack after that blow-up with Tony only makes sense if you look at two things at the same time: the rulebook and the ego. The rulebook says a boss is not supposed to put hands on a made guy in public. Not like that. Not over a personal rage moment. And definitely not in front of a room full of soldiers who are going to replay the scene in their heads for the next 10 years. The ego says Ralph cannot live with being treated like a kid getting smacked around at somebody else's club, especially when he thinks he is the smartest guy in the room and the biggest earner on the construction side. That incident is not just a fight. In their world, it is a public declaration: Tony can embarrass you, and you have to swallow it. The second Ralph feels that, he starts thinking in exits, not apologies. The important part is what Ralph cannot do. He cannot hit Tony back, because that is suicide. He cannot win the argument later, because Tony is the boss, and the boss decides what the argument even was. He cannot run to the guys in New Jersey and expect sympathy, because most of them will do what they always do: read the room, then protect their own position by keeping Tony happy. Even the ones who privately think Tony was out of line will never say it in a way that matters. That is the trap. Ralph has a legitimate grievance by the standards of that life, but the only person inside the family who can validate it is the same person who caused it. So if Ralph wants leverage, he needs an outside referee, someone powerful enough that Tony has to at least pretend to respect the process. That is where Johnny Sack comes in, and the reason it is Johnny specifically is because Johnny is not just a New York guy. He is the New York guy who actually interfaces with New Jersey. Carmine is the top, but Carmine does not sit around taking calls from every unhappy captain in another state. The way these families work, the boss stays insulated, and the underboss acts like the front door. Johnny is the gatekeeper, the negotiator, the guy who hears things early, and the guy who turns gossip into policy when it is useful. If you are in New Jersey and you want a serious message to reach the top in New York, you do not knock on Carmine's house. You speak to Johnny, because Johnny is the one who can make it real. Ralph also goes to Johnny because Ralph already knows what Johnny values. Johnny respects power, but he respects money even more, and Ralph is money. Ralph is construction, and construction is the one lane where New Jersey and New York are constantly overlapping, competing, sharing, and skimming. That overlap creates something that looks like friendship even when it is really mutual exploitation. Ralph has a reason to believe Johnny will listen, because Johnny has already listened before in other contexts. Even when they are not close, they have a working relationship in the one area that prints cash. Ralph is basically walking into the one office where he is not seen as Tony's problem. He is seen as an asset with numbers attached to him. And then there is the personal chemistry. Johnny is the kind of guy who makes you feel like you are talking business even when you are actually confessing insecurity. He is calm, controlled, and he speaks in rules, respect, and image. That is exactly the language Ralph wants to use after getting humiliated. Ralph does not want a shoulder to cry on. He wants a way to reframe what happened so he is not the loser. Johnny can do that by treating it like a political issue instead of a bar fight. A boss hit a made guy is not just a complaint, it is a claim. It implies consequences. It implies that Tony broke something bigger than Ralph's pride. Ralph goes to Johnny because Johnny is one of the few people who can nod at that claim without immediately fearing Tony's reaction. So why not anyone else? Why not Silvio, who understands the rules? Why not Paulie, who loves talking about how it's supposed to be? Why not Junior, who is older and obsessed with tradition? The answer is simple and ugly, because all of those people are still inside Tony's weather system. Even if they agree with Ralph for 1 second, they will still tell Tony what Ralph said, or they will use it later as a bargaining chip, or they will file it away as proof that Ralph is a problem. Inside New Jersey, any complaint about Tony becomes evidence against you, not against him. You cannot create leverage by asking your coworkers to judge your boss. You can only create leverage by finding someone whose power does not depend on Tony. And even if Ralph did talk to an internal figure, what would he be asking for? A ruling? A punishment? A forced apology? None of that is realistic. Tony might toss Ralph money or say a few words, but he is not going to let his own captains develop the habit of policing him. Once a boss starts accepting formal complaints, the whole thing turns into a courtroom, and the boss stops being the boss. Ralph knows that. He is a selfish guy, but he is not stupid. The only court that matters is outside the family, where another family can indirectly shame Tony by treating him like an equal who has to answer for his behavior. That is also why Ralph does not go to the other New York figures. He is not walking into random territory. He is picking the one person with maximum influence and maximum incentive to use Ralph's situation. Johnny has a reason to keep tabs on Tony's weaknesses, because New York always wants leverage over New Jersey, especially when big projects are involved. Tony needs New York, but New York does not need Tony in the same way. So if Johnny hears Tony hit a made guy in public, Johnny can store that fact like a weapon. He can bring it up later in negotiations. He can use it to test Tony's confidence. He can even use it to quietly encourage division inside New Jersey, because division makes Jersey cheaper. Ralph understands, on some level, that Johnny is not a therapist, he is a broker. You bring him a problem, he asks what the problem is worth. Ralph's problem is worth something because it touches Tony's legitimacy. That is why Ralph goes to him. Not because Johnny is nice, but because Johnny is positioned to convert Ralph's humiliation into political currency. Now look at how this lands on Tony emotionally, because Tony reacts on two tracks at once. On the surface, Tony is the boss, so he is furious at the idea that one of his captains is talking sideways to New York. That feels like disloyalty. It feels like a threat. It feels like somebody testing whether Tony's authority is real or just local. But underneath, Tony also knows he stepped out of bounds. That is the part that makes it burn. If Tony was completely in the right, he could punish Ralph cleanly. He could say, "You disrespected me, you're done," and most people would accept it. But Tony put himself in the worst spot. He did something that can be described as a breach of the code. And then the victim of that breach goes to the one place where codes get discussed, like law. So Tony is not just angry, he is anxious. Because when a captain takes your mistake to New York, it creates a possibility that should not exist. It creates the possibility that your own guys start believing there are authorities above you who can be appealed to. Even if nothing officially happens, the idea alone weakens you. Tony is always paranoid about respect, and this is respect at the structural level. It is the difference between they fear me and they believe in the position. Ralph going to Johnny risks turning Tony from a boss into a negotiator. It also hits Tony in a very personal way, because Tony's style of leadership depends on emotional dominance. Tony wants you to feel like he is the center, the father, the judge, the guy who can humiliate you and then forgive you. That is how he keeps people tied to him. Ralph refusing to stay inside that dynamic is a direct rejection of Tony's control. By going to Johnny, Ralph is basically saying, "I do not accept your version of what happened." Tony hears that as disrespect, even if Ralph frames it as procedure. And then there is the practical fear, which is money. Ralph is a top earner. Tony can hate him, but Tony needs what he brings in. When a top earner starts talking about leaving, it is not just a personnel issue, it is a budget issue. If Ralph moves to New York, Tony loses revenue and looks weak doing it. Other captains start wondering if they can shop their loyalty too. New York starts thinking of Jersey as a farm team. Tony's whole identity is, "I'm a boss." Losing Ralph to New York would make him look like a boss who cannot keep his own house together. So why does Ralph ask to be moved to a New York family at all when everyone knows that is not something you casually do? Because the request itself is leverage. Even if it never happens, it changes the conversation. Ralph is telling Johnny and indirectly telling Tony, "I have options." That is a crazy thing for a Jersey captain to say, because the whole system runs on the idea that you do not have options. You are in your family, you rise or you die there. By floating the idea of a transfer, Ralph is threatening to break the social contract that keeps these guys predictable. But it is also more than leverage. Ralph genuinely wants what New York represents. New York is bigger, richer, more real in their mythology. Ralph is not the kind of guy who is content being a local power under a boss who treats him like trash. He wants status. He wants to feel like he belongs among the serious players, not just a Jersey crew that gets laughed at behind closed doors. He has always been driven by the need to be seen as important. After Tony hits him, that need becomes urgent, because staying means accepting that he is small enough to be slapped. There is also a safety element. In that world, when you get into a personal war with a boss, you do not wait around to see where it goes. Even if Tony calms down, even if they shake hands, Ralph knows the relationship is poisoned. Tony has proven he can act impulsively with him, publicly, physically. That tells Ralph something frightening. It tells him Tony's hate is not just business hate, it is emotional, and emotional hate leads to unpredictable outcomes. A captain can survive business conflict. Emotional conflict is where people disappear. Asking to move is Ralph trying to put distance between himself and a boss who might eventually decide, "I'm done with him." Why not just lay low and earn? Because Ralph cannot do humility. He can fake it for a minute, but he cannot metabolize it. The minute he feels wronged, he wants to win the story. If Tony hits him and life goes on, then the story becomes, Tony can do that to you. Ralph needs a counter story. Going to Johnny creates a counter story. Tony crossed the line, and important people know it. Even if nothing happens, Ralph can tell himself he reclaimed some dignity. Johnny also benefits, which is why he listens at all. If Johnny can pull a valuable captain away from Tony, or even just make Tony worry that it could happen, that strengthens New York's hand. Johnny does not have to promise anything. He just has to let Ralph talk, let the possibility hang in the air. That alone pressures Tony. It is the same way Johnny plays a lot of situations. He does not always move immediately, he positions pieces. Ralph is the piece that irritates Tony, and irritation creates mistakes. Johnny wants Tony making mistakes. This is also why Ralph does not go to someone like Carmine directly, aside from the access issue. Going straight to the boss of another family without the proper channel can look like you are trying to cause trouble, or like you are disrespecting the structure. Johnny is the correct channel, so Ralph can frame it as I'm just asking for guidance, not I'm trying to start a war. Ralph wants to look like he is seeking order, not chaos. Johnny lets him do that. From Tony's perspective, the request to move is one of the most insulting things Ralph could do, because it implies Tony is not enough. It implies Tony's family is not legitimate, not protective, not profitable, not respectable. Tony already carries a chip on his shoulder about New York looking down on Jersey. He knows they call them small time. He knows New York has more muscle and more tradition. So when one of Tony's own captains tries to jump the fence, it confirms every insecurity Tony has about being the lesser boss. That is why Tony cannot just laugh it off. It hits his identity. But Tony also cannot overreact in the obvious way. If he punishes Ralph harshly right after Ralph complains, he validates the complaint. He proves that Ralph had reason to be afraid. And if New York is already aware of the situation, Tony has to be careful not to look like a guy who cannot control himself. That is why Tony tends to do this dance where he tries to smooth it over with money, with forced respect, with let's move past it, while still hating the guy. It is not forgiveness. It is containment. Tony is trying to keep the conflict from becoming a political fact. The whole thing becomes a perfect snapshot of why Ralph and Tony were always going to collide. Tony wants loyalty that feels emotional, almost family-like, even though it is built on fear. Ralph wants rules when the rules protect him and chaos when chaos serves him. When Tony hits him, Ralph suddenly becomes a rules guy because rules are the only weapon he has against a boss. And Johnny Sack, who lives and breathes politics, becomes the natural place Ralph goes to turn a personal humiliation into a formal grievance. So the answer to why not anyone else, is that Johnny is the one person who can do three things at once. He can listen without immediately reporting to Tony. He can potentially carry the issue upward without making Ralph look insane. And he can make Tony feel pressure without firing a single shot. Ralph is not going to Johnny because he thinks Johnny is his friend. Ralph is going to Johnny because Johnny is the closest thing to an outside judge and because the mere act of involving him is a threat. And the answer to how did it make Tony feel is that it makes Tony feel exposed. Not just challenged, exposed. It takes something Tony did in a moment of rage and turns it into something that can be discussed in the language of what's allowed. Tony can survive disrespect when he can crush it. What he cannot stand is disrespect that he cannot crush without proving the disrespect was justified. Ralph going to Johnny puts Tony in that exact corner. Finally, the reason Ralph asks to be moved is not because he expects a clean transfer like it is a job change. It is because he wants protection, status, and leverage all in one sentence. He wants to remind Tony that top earners are not just employees, they are power centers. He wants to remind New York that he is available as a tool. And he wants to remind himself that he is not stuck begging for scraps from a boss who already showed he is willing to humiliate him. In the end, that move tells you what Ralph really fears. He does not fear a beating. He fears being irrelevant. The slap is not painful because it hurt his face. It is painful because it put him back in his place. Johnny Sack is where Ralph goes to ask, quietly, if there is a higher place available and to make sure Tony knows he asked.